What's up? Ghost Fictions is here, and we're back again. This is the second part of a story where Izuku got the solo leveling system. But before we start, please consider subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Don't forget to check the description for more informations, and support the amazing author CrazyClouds for writing this story. Now, let's get into part 2. Dagoba Beach. Haven't been here in a while, Izuku muttered, staring at the trash-covered stretch of sand. It looked about the same as last time, although there might have been even more garbage piled up, if that was possible. It's the perfect place to train this new skill. Dominator's Touch activated. A rusty microwave was surrounded in a swirling green aura, and with a flex of his fingers, was compacted into a ball of scrap. Okay, so I need to actually focus on compression. It doesn't happen easily enough to be thoughtless. He held out his left hand now, both glowing with wavy emerald auroras. A broken coffee maker joined the spherical microwave. Can I control more than 2 objects? He pointed his right hand at another piece of junk, but as soon as a tire began to glow, the microwave dropped back to the sand. He tried again, this time with his left hand, to no avail. Maybe not? Or maybe I can't pick up more objects if I'm already holding something. I might be able to grab them all at once. Green surrounded a pile of junk, and the entire thing began to float. If he looked closely enough, though, he could tell that the wavy lights weren't wrapped around each individual object, and instead formed an orb around the entire group. Looks like the pile technically counts as one thing. Good to know. He let everything fall to the ground. Now, what's my weight limit? Because, if I'm able to crumple metal like it's paper, then I'm assuming it's pretty high. Izuku glanced around, his gaze landing on a stripped, rusted-out car chassis. Seriously, how does this stuff even get here? He murmured, rolling his eyes. Pointing one palm at the chassis, he activated Dominator's Touch. Nothing happened. Furrowing his eyebrows, he tried again, and again, then with 2 hands. Finally, the stupid thing began to hover, though it was only a few inches off the ground before it felt like something snapped in Izuku's mind, and it fell back to the sand heavily. "Urk!" Izuku cried, a hand flying to his face, which was suddenly warm. A hot liquid streamed onto his palm. Izuku glanced down to find his fingers stained crimson. Violent shivers racked his spine, and he forced himself to look away. The teen hurried over to the surf, kneeling at the edge to rinse his hand in the salt water, bringing a few handfuls up to splash on his face. The water turned a bit pink, before dispersing into the tide and removing all traces of his nosebleed. Note to self, don't overdo it, he whispered, trying to calm his racing heart. Luckily, he was able to regenerate pretty quickly, so the bleeding stopped in less than a minute, but he was still slightly on edge. I'll need to increase my proficiency. Dominator's Touch is only at level 1 right now. Maybe my weight limit will increase as the level does, he rambled quietly, trying to ignore the metallic scent overwhelming his senses. Excuse me, are you Dash? Izuku screeched, leaping a solid 5 meters in the air, landing in a handstand to face the person that had snuck up behind him. Alright, the man finished. My apologies, young man, I didn't mean to startle you so badly, he cried, bowing. It's fine, Izuku said hurriedly, flipping back to his feet. I just wasn't tall, thin as a rail, floppy yellow blonde hair, and piercing, shadowed, electric blue eyes. That's All Might. Paying attention, All Might's skeletal form coughed into a fist, no doubt hiding the spurt of blood. Still, it was rude of me. Although, it's rare for me to find anyone else here. That's All Might. May I ask what brought you to this trash heap? Does he not recognize me? I'm just training, Izuku lied. I thought it would be fine, since there's nobody else around, but I'll just go. Sorry. All Might waved his hands. No, there's no need for that. I was the one intruding. So, you were training? Might I ask what your quirk is? I don't have one. You already know that. It's, telekinesis. Or, something like that. All Might raised a brow, but didn't comment. Sounds impressive. Any particular reason you're practicing with it? You should already know. I wanna go to UA and become a hero? All Might nodded, like he believed it without a second thought. May I see a demonstration? I find myself curious that you would need to come all the way out here to train. Are there any serious drawbacks to your quirk? Izuku swallowed dryly. And no, it's pretty standard. You know, move stuff with your mind, the teen said, chuckling nervously. He held out a hand, letting Dominator's Touch flow through the air and wrap around a piece of scrap metal, levitating it and throwing it deeper into the landfill. Well, with a quirk like that, there's no doubt you'll go far. You will be a great hero, All Might said with a gaunt grin. Anyways, there's a few errands I need to run, so I'll be going now. Perhaps we'll meet again, young man. Izuku said nothing, just watching the symbol of peace walk away. With a quirk like that, he managed to hold it together until he got home. Slamming open the front door and ignoring his mom's startled shout, Izuku rushed towards the bathroom, throwing himself down in front of the toilet just in time for bile to spill from his mouth. With a quirk like that, His convulsing intensified. "You will be a great hero." There was nothing left in his stomach, but he couldn't stop dry heaving. "I'm sorry to say, but without a quirk, you cannot be a hero." He wasn't sure whether he was retching or sobbing anymore. Probably both. "Maybe you should take a swan dive from the roof and hope for a quirk in your next life." Quirk, 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 why is it always about a quirk? Does who I am not matter? This power isn't even mine, it's from the system. Izuku, what's wrong? Does that mean I'm still worthless? Izuku, no matter how strong I become with this borrowed power. Warm arms wrapped around his head, pressing his face into his mother's stomach, heedless of the tears, snot, and vomit being smeared on her cardigan. Will I always be weak? Weeks passed. School started back up. Izuku was awarded more and better dungeon keys for completing the daily quest. Most of the time, he sent his shadows to do the work for him, both because it was so much faster with his entire army fighting to clear the dungeon, and simply because he couldn't work up the motivation to fight by himself. The only time Izuku stepped in these days was during the boss fight, but really, he didn't even need to do that. Igris, name shortened from Blood Red Commander Igris, because that was far too edgy, was the strongest of Izuku's shadows. He looked exactly the same as when he was the boss of the Job Change dungeon, but his armor was now black, the lines between the plates glowing with an emerald green light. He was an elite knight at level 11. There was also Sho the Winter Shogun, A/N, Winter Shogun from Konosuba, but with a black and green color scheme, a large samurai wielding a blade of pitch black, a stark contrast to when it was a being of pure white, back in that snowy mountain dungeon who was an elite knight of level 5. Between those two, dungeons B rank and below were a breeze. A rank was only slightly more difficult, and Izuku had to put in some effort for those, but overall, nothing he couldn't handle. It was undeniable that he'd gotten stronger. But this wasn't his power, so Izuku felt nothing as he leveled up. Not pride, not joy, nothing. Life went on. Izuku, yeah, Mom, if something's bothering you, you can always talk to me. You know that, right? Izuku blinked, and Inko felt her heart break a little bit. Everything's fine, Mom, I'm gonna head to school, I have monitor duty today. Bye. She waved her son out the door, and sat down heavily on the living room couch. Something had happened to her baby. So many things had changed, ever since that day when the hospital called, saying he'd been found on the beach, covered in so much blood it was like he'd fallen in a pool full of it. Inko had 3 consecutive panic attacks, and probably would have had more if the kind man that found her son, Yagi-san, wasn't there to distract her with idle conversation. His dramatic growth spurt nearly gave the woman a heart attack. But it didn't seem to be the result of anything untoward. In fact, Izuku had been happier than he had been in years. He was exercising, and smiling more, and spending time with Inko rather than holing up in his room, watching hero fights on his computer. But there were a few things that Inko still didn't really get. How did he grow so much within a few days of being discharged from the hospital? Inko was sure it wasn't steroids, but maybe his quirk had finally developed, after being thrown into some life-threatening situation he couldn't remember? If that was the case, though, why wasn't he shouting it from the rooftops? Inko knew her son, or at least, she thought she did, and knew that one of the greatest disappointments of his young life was having a second joint in his pinky toe. If one of his biggest barriers to fulfilling his life's aspiration of being a hero were to suddenly disappear, wouldn't he have at least told her? Or were they not even that close anymore, despite how much time they'd spent together recently? It made sense, in a way that squeezed the air from her lungs. After Dr. Tsubasa cruelly shattered his dream, Inko had been the first to stomp upon the remains. She hadn't supported him in his time of need, hadn't told him when he asked, tears rolling down his tiny face like a waterfall, that he could be a hero, even without a quirk. And why had she thought that? There were plenty of heroes whose quirks didn't turn them into another All Might. The wild pussycats came to mind. Of the 4-person cat-themed squad, only one could be considered a powerhouse due to their quirk, Pixie Bob, with her Earth Flow. Ragdoll Search and Mandalay's Telepath were purely mental, lacking in obvious combat applications. Tora's Pliabody just made him more flexible. His strength had been built through years of hard work, not because of a physical enhancement quirk. And despite all that, they were in the top 50 of Japan's Hero Billboard chart 32nd, if Inko remembered correctly. Izuku could always have been a hero, Inko had just been too blind to see that. Not anymore, though. She'd support him, now, like she should have for the past 10 years. She'd also be going to poke around his room real quick and see if she could find anything potentially incriminating. Because seriously, nobody grew that fast randomly, and where'd he get the money to buy her that dress for her birthday? Was he maybe not taking drugs, but instead selling them? Izuku came home that afternoon to find his mother sitting on the couch, staring at the hallway intently, like she was waiting for him. "I'm home," he said, confused as to why her gaze was so intense. "Welcome back, Izuku," Inko greeted automatically. I want to apologize, because I searched your room while you were gone to see if you were taking drugs. I understand that it's a breach of privacy, but you've changed a lot in the past few months, so I believe it was a valid concern. Okay, I guess? Find anything interesting? A part of Izuku's mind was shocked that he was taking this so well. The other part was just curious. No, which I'm grateful for, Inko said. Although, just to be sure, you aren't doing drugs, right? Not steroids, or trigger, or anything like that. Izuku shook his head, and the woman breathed a sigh of relief. That's good, right? Izuku said dumbly, pointing in the direction of his bedroom. So, I'm gonna go do my homework dash. Izuku, the teen snapped his jaw shut. You're going to be a great hero? Was he hearing things now? I should have told you that, so long ago. She rose to her feet, taking a step towards him. In their small living room, that meant she'd covered about a quarter of the distance between them. I should have ignored what Dr. Tsubasa said, because he was an asshole. She took another step. Izuku jolted at her language. What kind of man would call a child hopeless, right to his face? A man whose advice I should have ignored. Another step. All you wanted to do was save people. It's all you ever wanted to do. She stood right in front of him now. You don't need a quirk, because you've always had the heart of a hero. And that means more than any quirk could. You're going to be a wonderful hero, and this time, I'm going to do my best to help you get there. Salt water pricked the corner of Izuku's eyes, and within moments, crocodile tears were rolling down his cheeks as he fell to his knees, wailing. Inko crouched down in front of her son, wrapping her arms around him, and he buried his face in her shoulder, barely muffling his raucous sobs. It's okay, baby. Let it out, I'm here. His crying redoubled, but Inko just held him tight, whispering reassurances into his ear and running her fingers through his hair. It took a long 5 minutes before he was able to calm down, but when he did, he separated himself from his mother. Oh, God. I got snot all over your shirt, Izuku despaired, making Inko chuckle. It's fine. I can just go change. Izuku wasn't exactly in the best state of mind at the moment, so he didn't see any problem in using Dominator's touch to bring over a box of tissues. He pulled one from the box, then set to wiping at his mother's sleeve, heedless of her astounded expression. Izuku, she choked out. Yeah, he replied absent-mindedly, scrubbing a bit harder. What did you just do? Izuku blinked, glanced at the box now in his hand, even though he hadn't gotten up, paled dramatically. Good question. They talked, and talked, and talked long after the sun went down. Izuku did his best to explain the system without getting into all the gory details. He completely skipped over how it all started, because he wasn't ready for that, and it seemed to go well enough, because Inko only cried twice. Plus, he hadn't gotten any alarms about being punished for revealing the existence of the system. Maybe it was just because it was his mother, though. He definitely wasn't going to be testing it by shouting about his borrowed power from the rooftops. So, you're going to use these new abilities to help you pass the U.A entrance exam, his mother clarified once his word vomit stopped. Izuku paused, opening and closing his mouth a few times. I don't know, he finally admitted. Inko spasmed. You don't know? The woman asked, sounding scandalized. Izuku, this could really help you out. I know I said that even without a quirk, you'd be a great hero, but with one, you could become even better than All Might. Think of all the people you could save. Really? Even though it's not my power? Inko's eyebrows furrowed awkwardly in confusion. What does that even mean? This power? The system's giving it to me. It doesn't come from me. So does it really count as my own ability? Wouldn't it be cheating if I used it to pass the exam? Inko fixed him with her flattest, most unimpressed stare, making Izuku squirm under her gaze. Izuku, that's dumb. If I gave you an All Might figurine for your birthday, is it still mine? No. Then since the system gave you this power, doesn't that mean it's yours now, I guess? Inko nodded with finality. Good. No more of that, then, you prince of nonsense, she said fondly, reaching up and ruffling his hair, pulling half of it out the tie. You just go knock everyone off their feet at the entrance exam, you hear me? She asked sternly, though Izuku could see the glimmer of amusement in her jade eyes. Roger. Izuku replied, snapping off a salute. They both laughed, and hugged gently. I'll use my power, and become the greatest hero in the world, Izuku whispered, though a part of him didn't believe him. Not yet, anyways it'd come around. I know, Inko replied simply. Status. Name, Midoriya Izuku. Level, 67. Job, Shadow Monarch. Title, Wolf Slayer. Fatigue, 0. Stats. Level, 67. HP, 27,435. MP, 3,180. 45% physical damage reduction. Strength, 309. Agility, 299. Vitality, 283. Intelligence, 327. Sense, 263. Remaining points, 0. Izuku, wake up, Inko shouted, bursting into her son's room. said Sun responded with a shriek, launching himself halfway to the ceiling before falling to the floor heavily, tangled in his sheets. Wah, you're gonna be late for the exam. Go shower. The teen's head finally wormed out of the pile of blankets, and he stared at her like a deer in the headlights. Hurry, Inko called one last time, for emphasis, before leaving, closing the door behind her. And wear something nice. Her son stepped into the living room 10 minutes later, clothed in. Izuku, Inko breathed, wide-eyed, I didn't mean to wear your suit. What? He glanced down at his black, slim-fitting ensemble, complete with a dark red tie. You said nice. This is nice. Honey, most people usually wear their junior high's uniform to high school entrance exams, she explained patiently. Izuku blinked. Oh. Inko shook her head with an exasperated sigh. Never mind. It's too late to change now. Just eat quickly. You've got to get going soon. Izuku made a slightly offended face at the dismissal, but did as he was told, scarfing down the eggs. He scooped up his hideously yellow backpack, shoving his arm through the loops and grabbing the knob of the front door, only for his mother to call back. Izuku, wait. He froze, hand still gripping the brass. Ah. She hurried into her room, rushing back out with a brown leather satchel. If you're going to wear a suit, then you need a bag that matches. She held it out for him, and Izuku hesitantly accepted. It took only a few moments to transfer everything he needed, just pencils, erasers, a calculator, and his school ID, and then he slung the single long strap over his neck. The woman grabbed his tie, quickly adjusting it, then patted him on the chest, nodding with finality. You look great. Now, go get first place in that exam, you hear me? She asked sternly, smiling broadly. Izuku grinned back. Right, I'm off, then. He's standing in front of his dream. In front of UA. At the moment, though, his mind was a bit preoccupied. Why didn't the daily quest come in today? Did I just miss the notification? No, it's not in the inbox. It was remarkably concerning. The daily quest had been a constant ever since his awakening. For it to suddenly stop appearing meant that something changed, and Izuku had no clue what. He shook his head, making his ponytail flop a bit. I don't have time to worry about that, he muttered, picking up the pace. Oi, Deku. He continued moving without acknowledging the call. I'm fucking talking to you, Deku. Don't ignore me, you bastard. Izuku pointedly did not turn around. Feet pounded on the packed dirt, and an attempt was made to grab his arm, but with his sense being so high now, it was trivial to avoid it. Wah, who the fuck do you think you are? Bakugo seethed quietly, well, quietly for him. He was trying, and failing, to not make a scene, and Izuku's lack of cooperation was definitely making it a lot harder. Too bad for him, Izuku had more important things to take care of, which didn't include bothering with the kid who told him to jump off a roof. He walked all the way to the written exam instruction center with Bakugo on his tail the whole way. What a pain. The written test was alright. Izuku was fairly certain he passed, but other than that, he was just trying not to think about it, lest anxiety rear its ugly head and throw off his performance in the practical exam. He was now in an auditorium, crammed with hundreds of other students, waiting for the brief to begin. Say something, shitty Deku. Unfortunately, Bakugo was also there, sitting right next to Izuku, which was more than a bit inconvenient. The kid just would not stop bugging him. At this point, Izuku was seriously considering responding, just to end the torture, but that meant giving in to his bully one more time. Not on my fucking life. The spotlight at the front of the giant room flickered on, and standing on the stage underneath it was pro-hero present Mike. Izuku turned his full attention to the announcer, blocking out the ash blonde next to him. Crush robots, get points. That was what it all boiled down to. Izuku stood in front of the massive gates to Battle Center B. How many of these things are there? Udata seriously has too much money, hands tucked into the pockets of his suit. He watched as the other teens around him stretched, dealt with pre-test jitters, or chatted jiltedly with the students near them, the undercurrent of competition making it a bit difficult for some to be friendly at the moment. Thankfully, Bakugo was assigned to a different center, as they came from the same junior high. That didn't mean this center didn't have its own loudmouth. Excuse me, you, in the suit, a glasses-wearing blue-haired teen called, grabbing Izuku's attention. It was the same boy who had interrupted present Mike, asking about the zero-pointer. Slightly startled, Izuku pointed at himself in confusion, earning an emphatic nod from the square boy. Yes, I heard you and that boy with pointy hair talking the entire time in the auditorium. Don't you feel any shame for distracting the other test takers? Moreover, why are you wearing a suit? Are you even taking this seriously? Are you, perhaps, simply here to interfere with the exam? The guy asked. Izuku's face twisted into some amalgamation of about 50 different expressions, unable to determine which was the most appropriate for this particular situation. Okay, start. I'll deal with you later, Izuku settled for, rushing through the now open gates. Arise. His shadow became black as the void, casting out to form a large circle on the ground beneath him. From the darkness rose his shadows, glowing with their ghastly emerald lights, looking incredibly ominous despite the sun being directly overhead. Izuku began barking orders. The 7 shadow magicians went up on the roofs, playing to their long-range advantage, while minimizing the risk of getting into a close-range confrontation. The 80 infantry units, consisting of 32 knights from the Job Change dungeon, and 48 Roman legionnaires from a Colosseum dungeon, split into 4 squads and took to the main streets. The 5 shadow ogres wandered off in different directions, 4 shadow trolls following each, all from an island dungeon. Finally, the 20 shadow wolves, from the same snowy mountain dungeon as Sho, disappeared into the alleys. Izuku perched on the corner of a rooftop, watching the chaos unfold. Behind him stood Igris, Commander Level 12, Sho, Commander Level 3, Nero, boss of the Colosseum dungeon, a skeleton clad in ornate Roman-style armor and a once-purple cloak, Elite Knight Level 14, and the giant form of Polyphemus, Cyclops boss of the island dungeon, wearing a sheepskin loincloth that thankfully covered everything. Elite Knight Level 19. You guys can just do whatever, the teen told them. Nodding, Nero stepped off the building, going to join his legionaries, while Polyphemus dropped to the asphalt with devastating force, crushing a 2-pointer beneath his enormous weight. Izuku sighed as the Cyclops bellowed raucously at a throng of 3-pointers, lumbering off to destroy them. So rowdy. This is boring. 7 or so minutes had passed since the start of the exam, and Izuku hadn't moved. He sat at the edge of the roof, feet dangling over the side carelessly, scrolling the hero forums on his phone. Only a few of his shadows had taken damage, and his MP had already filled back up after regenerating them. Seriously, I expected this to at least be a little challenging, he muttered sulkily. I guess robots just aren't that sophisticated. It made sense, kinda. Ever since the Quark Revolution, technological progress had really slowed down. It was often said near the turn of the century that if not for quarks, they would have already been living in colonies on Mars, never mind the fact that some quarks could really help with that. He glanced behind him at Sho and Igris, who were playing Janken. They noticed their liege looking, eyed him for a moment, then went back to it. Sho threw out a rock, while Igris played scissors, and the samurai chased the knight around the rooftop, trying to crush his fingers with an armor-clad glove. Izuku blinked. What the fuck? He turned around. That wasn't something he wanted to address at the moment. Less than 2 minutes left. Present Mike roared from outside the stadium. At that moment, the building he was on rumbled. Glancing around, his attention was caught by the asphalt of a nearby 4-way intersection splitting open. From beneath the ground rose an absolutely gargantuan robot, probably 20 times the size of Polyphemus, Izuku's largest shadow. Speaking of which, there he goes, Izuku murmured, watching as the Cyclops rushed towards what had to be the 0-pointer, only for a giant fist to smash through him, dispersing the shadow like a cloud of gas. Izuku dismissed his one-eyed servant before he could pull himself together, also recalling the rest of his army. The only one remaining was Sho, who knelt reverently before his liege, holding out his pitch-black katana with 2 hands. Izuku grabbed the dark sheath, drawing the equally black blade, turning it over in his hand a few times to familiarize himself with the grip. Daggers definitely won't be long enough to do anything other than scratch that thing, he noted idly, resheathing the blade. Then again, this won't either if I'm not close enough. Could be fun. Despite its size, Izuku's senses told him the 0-pointer was hardly dangerous. It gave off about the same level of malice as the boss of an E-rank dungeon, maybe. Then again, that was hardly surprising, since it was designed to be used in a practical exam, not a fight for their lives. Although, Izuku was the only one that didn't seem to be running. It was actually kind of disappointing. From his little perch, he'd observed the other test takers, and found their skills to be lacking. 10 or so years with their quirks, and this was the best they had to offer? Maybe that was why the daily quest didn't come in today, and why Izuku suspected it wouldn't make a sudden reappearance tomorrow. The system thought he could finally stand on his own. Well, I can't disappoint it. Dropping to the concrete, Izuku sprinted down the street at blistering speeds. When he was about 50 meters from the 0-pointer, he leaped halfway up a 4-story building, using the wall as a surface to push off of, landing on the robot's outstretched arm. He ran up the metallic limb with gravity-defying balance, stopping on the mech's shoulder. Izuku held the sheathed katana at his hip, grabbing the hilt and mimicking the stance he'd seen Sho take numerous times. Quick drawl. Ripping the katana from the scabbard, he rotated it 90 degrees, so the edge was pointing at his foe instead of at the ground far below, and slashed with as much force as he could. The blade sheared through the metal, and concentrated air pressure tore apart the 0-pointer's thick neck. With the creak of steel, the head fell to the street, crashing heavily into the asphalt, sending debris flying in every direction. Izuku hopped off the robotic carcass, landing lightly on the road. The teen dropped Sho's katana into his shadow, allowing the samurai to reclaim his weapon. That was fun. A week later, the letter from U.A came. Izuku wasn't very worried, but his mother was somewhat nervous, so to reassure her that everything was fine, he decided to watch the hologram in the living room with her. Are you sure you don't want to watch it alone first? Inko asked, sitting next to him on the couch. Izuku gave her a small smile. It's fine, Mom. He pressed the button in the middle of the metal disc that came in the envelope, and a holographic All Might appeared. I am here, as a projection, the #1 hero boomed, startling the mother and son. Why is All Might showing up in your acceptance letter? Inko asked. Izuku just shrugged, a helpless expression on his face. He had no clue, either. Maybe it had something to do with why the #1 had been seen in Muzurifu quite frequently in the last few months. I'm sure you're wondering what I'm doing here. The truth is, I've decided to become a teacher at U.A. And now, on to your results. You did very well on the written exam, Midoriya Shonen, coming out as one of the top scorers. As for the practical exam, you took down many robots, earning you several villain points, but that's not it. After all, what sort of hero school wouldn't reward you for saving other people? And that's where the rescue points come in. Through the combined efforts of your Dark Army, you earned 312 villain points and 45 rescue points, for a whopping total of 357 points, a new record in U.A's history. The previous was set by myself, at 159 points. Consider me impressed, Midoriya Shonen. Hopefully, you continue to do great things here at U.A, your hero academia. The hologram shut off, and the Midoriyas sat staring at the empty air for a few moments. Then, Inko wrapped her arms around Izuku's waist with a crushing grip, tears bursting from her eyes. Izuku, she wailed. I know, he said soothingly, pulling an arm around her shoulders. He rubbed small circles around her back, idly tapping his foot against the floorboards. My hero academia? I like the sound of that. Izuku stood in front of the giant door to Class 1A, his class, mentally preparing himself. Inside would be some of the top students in the country, those bound to do great things in life, even if they ultimately decided that the hero industry wasn't for them. He wouldn't lie to himself, he was rather intimidated, regardless of the fact that he hadn't even met them yet. Logically, he knew that very few of them were likely to be malicious, if any. However, after growing up in the same class as Bakugo Katsuki, Izuku had a rather skewed view of talented students. All he could really do was hope that their powerful quirks and success in school hadn't made them as arrogant and conceited as his childhood bully. After all, this wasn't a dungeon. If someone made him uncomfortable, he couldn't just jam a dagger in their throat and call it a day. Here, he'd have to use his words, or risk being expelled. As someone whose voice had been muffled for just about his entire life, though, he didn't have much confidence in his ability to solve his problems civilly. Maybe if I don't say anything to anyone, they'll leave me alone? Izuku sighed. That had never worked on Bakugo, only pissed the ash blonde off something fierce. Although, most of the bullying he'd experienced had been a result of being quirkless. While he technically still was quirkless, his awakening could be passed off as one, so his classmates at least wouldn't have that to hold against him. I really hope Bakugo's not in my class, but there's no doubt he got into UA. What if he tells everyone I used to be quirkless? Excuse me, are you going to go in? Someone asked from behind him. Izuku twitched, glancing over his shoulder. It was a short girl with brown hair that hung just above her shoulders, except for her bangs. There were these weird pink marks on her cheeks, like she'd stamped permanent blush onto her face. She looked cute enough, but then, so had a few of his female junior high classmates, and they'd ended up being some of his most vicious bullies. Yeah, sorry. Izuku's voice was scratchy from nerves. Okay, maybe I can't go for the entirety of high school without saying anything, but I can definitely keep it below 10 words. He slid open the giant seriously, it was huge door, and stepped into the classroom, keeping his eyes pointed at the linoleum floor. Some of his more volatile bullies took making eye contact as a challenge, and something so simple had led to more than a handful of beatings, so Izuku wanted to be extra careful not to cause any problems. Of course, that was no longer possible when he read the seating assignment hung on the blackboard at the front of the room, and discovered he was placed right behind Bakugo Katsuki. His shoulders slumped a bit. Kami hates me. Izuku trudged to his seat as somberly as a death row inmate, doing his best to ignore the way Bakugo's heated glare tried to bore a hole into his skull. Don't say anything, don't say anything, don't. Oi, Deku, god fucking damn it. Izuku shuffled past Bakugo, thoughtlessly avoiding the low-key swipe at his arm, and eased himself into his seat. He pulled his phone out, opening up the hero forums through sheer muscle memory, but he couldn't concentrate on anything his eyes passed over, the continuous stream of curses echoing too loudly in his mind for him to focus. A crackling sound made Izuku stiffen. He wouldn't be hurt, couldn't be hurt, really, by Bakugo, but this wasn't Urudara. If the hateful teen used his quirk on Izuku, they would probably both be thrown out, Bakugu for breaking UA's anti-bullying rules, and Izuku because he was Izuku. "Stop fucking ignoring me, Deku," Bakugu hissed, turning to sit sideways in his chair, slamming an elbow on Izuku's desk. The green-haired boy pointedly kept his gaze on his phone, but his internal panic was skyrocketing to an all-time high. If Bakugu actually attacked him when he was so stressed, Izuku didn't know what he'd do. Maybe he'd just take it, stunned beyond belief at the lack of impulse control. At the opposite end of the spectrum, he might lash out in turn, accidentally killing the bully, and that would be the end of it. "Oi, shitty Deku," Bakugu barked, raising his hand to slam it on Izuku's desk in a puff of smoke, a favorite intimidation tactic of his. Dominator's touch activated. Writhing emerald wisps surrounded both Izuku and Bakugu's hands, stopping the blonde cold. Wadash! Bloodlust activated. Bakugu's voice died down to an involuntary whimper, and Izuku smiled at him tightly. "Please stop making a scene," he murmured, lowly enough that only Bakugu could hear. The blonde only nodded shakily, turning around the instant Izuku released the telekinetic hold on his hand. Izuku could barely make out the shaking of his shoulders through the somewhat thick uniform jacket. Satisfied that the situation was dealt with, at least for now, bloodlust might be level 3, but it still only lasted for 5 minutes. Izuku cast a covert glance around the room. A few people were peering at him curiously, probably wondering what he'd done to make the obviously hostile Bakugu stop his shit, but otherwise, they weren't paying attention to him. Izuku sighed in relief, crisis averted. The door opened once more, and seeing as all the desks were already filled, Izuku could only assume that the man that walked in was their teacher. It seemed a bit unlikely, though, considering he looked homeless. Long, shaggy hair, an untrimmed beard, and black clothes. A roll of bandages hung around his neck like a scarf, and he was dragging a yellow sack behind him. The man stood in front of the podium, sipping quietly from a juice pack as he waited for the rest of the students to stop talking. When they did, he sighed raggedly. "It took you 12 seconds to quiet down," the man rasped. "You kids simply aren't rational. You can't waste time like that. I'm Aizawa Shoyuta. I'll be your homeroom teacher. It's a bit sudden, but we'll be going outside now. Follow me to the locker rooms, and get changed into the track suits provided. Then meet me on the field." With that, Aizawa-sensei shuffled out of the classroom, leaving stunned silence in his wake. Apparently, Aizawa-sensei really wasn't the type of guy who liked to waste time, because they were already doing a quirk assessment. "What about the entrance ceremony, or orientation?" the brown-haired girl with pink cheeks from earlier asked. Izuku was wondering the same thing. Would he have to use trial and error to figure out how to navigate the labyrinthine building? "If you're going to become a hero, you don't have time for such leisurely activities," Aizawa-sensei responded drolly. U.A's selling point is the amount of freedom the students have, of course. That goes for the teachers as well, and that includes skipping useless stuff. Anyways, this is basically one of those physical fitness tests you've been doing since junior high, except this time, you'll be able to use your quirks. As expected of U.A's hero course, we'll be able to use our quirks as much as we want, one student said. "This looks like it'll be really fun," another chirped. Aizawa-sensei twitched at that, and Izuku would bet money that he was hiding a frown behind his scarf. However, the man didn't say anything to broadcast his irritation, instead instructing them to get ready for the tests. Up first was the classic 50-meter dash. The physical fitness test had been held before Izuku's awakening last year, so his scores for that were pretty bad. He was kinda excited to see numerical proof that he'd improved, even if there was no doubt that he was basically a completely different person. Some of his classmates did pretty well, like the blue-haired boy who'd harassed him at the entrance exam. He had engines in his calves, so he was basically made for this kinda stuff. Then, there was the brown-haired girl, who tapped her tracksuit and shoes with glowing pink fingertips, and proceeded to run normally. Izuku had no idea what her quirk was. Something that reduced weight, maybe? Izuku was up fourth, next to Bakugu. He elected not to use the provided foot pedestal, instead sinking into a crouch, most of his weight on his front foot in preparation for an explosive first step. "You're gonna eat my fucking dust, shitty Deku," Bakugu growled, looking straight ahead down the track. Izuku ignored him. Sprint activated. "On your mark," the robot announced. Izuku leaned forward in anticipation. "Get set." He tensed his front leg. The gunshot sounded, and Izuku blurred forward, vanishing to the eyes of his classmates. 0.1 seconds. He reappeared at the end of the track, skidding to a halt, kicking up a small cloud of dust. Straightening up, Izuku glanced back at Bakugu, who was frozen in place, staring at him wide-eyed. The green-haired teen held his gaze for just a moment, before moving back to his place in the line. A series of explosions propelled Bakugu across the finish line, clocking in at 5.49 seconds, but he didn't stop there. Instead, he rocketed straight for Izuku, reaching out to grab the back of the taller boy's collar and yank him backwards. Of course, Izuku simply turned to the side, easily avoiding it, but Bakugo wasn't deterred. The blonde landed heavily, face set in a rictus of fury. "Goddamn Deku, what the fuck was that? Since when did you have a quirk, you piece of shit?" Izuku just leaned back, hands in front of him like a barrier. He said nothing, letting Bakugo vent. He glanced at Aizawa-sensei, who was staring at the spectacle with a blank face rather than moving to break it up. Izuku sighed, another teacher who just didn't care. Surprisingly, though, Aizawa-sensei did act when Bakugo drew back his hand, quirk flaring. The ribbon scarf lashed out, wrapping around the bully and restraining him effortlessly. Meanwhile, Aizawa's eyes had begun glowing red, and his hair was floating. Hanging from his neck, now visible with the scarf out of the way, was a pair of yellow, slitted goggles that Izuku recognized as belonging to a little-known underground hero. "Eraserhead," he muttered, more than a little shocked. Aizawa-sensei seemed to hear him, and his eyes flickered to Izuku for a scant moment, but they turned back to Bakugo quickly. "What do you think you're doing?" Aizawa-sensei asked menacingly. Bakugo glared back, unfazed. He tugged against the capture gear to no avail. "Geez, making me use my quirk for something like this, I have dry eye," he barked. Izuku almost laughed at the unexpected turn of events. For an amazing quirk like Erasure, which relied on the user's eyes, it seemed like such a waste. Aizawa released Bakugo, once he was sure the blonde was done acting out. "Whoever's up next, go. We're wasting time." The second test was grip strength. Aizawa-sensei led them to an indoor gymnasium nearby, and rolled a cart of sensors out of the storage room. Everyone grabbed one quickly, and spread out across the polished wood floor. Already, some groups were forming, certain students simply gravitating towards each other. As to be expected, Izuku was alone, so he just focused on the device in his hand. "It's U.A, so they've probably got some pretty high-quality equipment, right? I guess I can just go all out, then," Izuku muttered to himself, squeezing the grip meter. Crunch. He uncurled his fist, watching with dread as shards of plastic and metal fell to the floorboards. "You broke it?" a raspy voice asked, and Izuku felt his soul leave his body. He immediately turned to his teacher, bending at the waist in an overly proper bow. "I'm sorry. I didn't think it would. I'll pay for the replacement," he promised. "It's fine," Aizawa-sensei said, waving him off. "They can pay for hundreds of robots with the sole purpose of being destroyed by a bunch of loud brats. U.A's budget can handle something like this." Izuku swallowed nervously, not entirely believing him, but also not sure the man would waste time lying about something this insignificant. "Oh, okay, then. Am I going to get a score?" he asked nervously. "Yeah. They only go up to 999 kilograms, so I'll just mark that. You're not the first to ever break one." That was a slight relief. Izuku relaxed a bit, nodding shakily. His part done, he glanced around the gymnasium once more, noticing a few students crowding around a large, multi-armed boy. With his high sense, he could hear them chattering excitedly about him getting 540 kilograms despite not being very close to them. Izuku casually folded his arms behind his back, inconspicuously hiding the broken meter. Luckily, nobody had tried to ask him about his incredible score on the 50-meter dash. They were too stunned to even consider it, but he didn't want to tempt them. The less he interacted with his classmates, the better. The third test was the standing long jump. The sand pit was 10 meters across, and there didn't seem to be any way to measure how far someone landed beyond that, so Izuku guiltily half-assed it, landing about 15 meters away from the starting spot. He could have gone further, much further, but again, there wasn't much point. The fourth test was repeated side steps. Izuku did decently. He had just under 300 agility, which definitely helped, but he still only came second, after a tiny kid with grapes for hair. During the fifth test, the ball throw, Izuku saw something truly amazing. The brown-haired girl with pink cheeks threw the ball, and it never came back down. Eventually, Aizawa-sensei showed them his phone. Instead of a number, it displayed the infinity symbol. Did she remove the gravity of the ball? Izuku wondered. She'd floated herself across the standing long jump in a similar fashion, but Izuku hadn't connected the dots. Well, as interesting as her quirk was, there wasn't any point in thinking too much about it at the moment. It was his turn, after all. Aizawa-sensei handed him a new ball. There was no way they were ever getting the previous one back, and Izuku walked over to the circle. He tossed the ball up and down a few times, the slight weight settling easily into his palm. "It's not that heavy. If I just throw it, it'll be slowed down by air resistance before it goes very far. I could maybe get 700 meters before that happened, like Bakugo, but it would probably go further if I tried something else." Arise? From the darkness behind him rose one of his shadow wolves. This one had heavy scars, showing as glowing emerald green gashes against its black skin. It was rather large, even sitting on its haunches, wagging its tail happily as it waited for orders. It was about as tall as Izuku. Standing, its shoulders were probably higher than his. Izuku gently pushed the ball into his servant's mouth, and pointed in front of him, knowing the wolf would understand. With a shake of its shaggy mane, the beast took off in a harried sprint, powerful legs sending it bounding off past the tree line quickly. Before long, it was completely out of sight, leaving the class staring off into the distance. Midoriya, how far can that thing go? Aizawa-sensei asked. I don't know, Izuku admitted. I don't think there is a limit, really. It'll keep going until I call it back. Aizawa nodded. I'll mark you down the same as Uraraka. You can get back in line. Because of her infinity score, the brown-haired girl Uraraka was going to be given the next highest score, +1. He was more than satisfied with that. Unfortunately, it seemed like this was the straw that broke the camel's back, and his classmates had finally become curious enough about his unorthodox abilities that someone asked. Hey, what exactly is your quirk? A blonde with a black lightning bolt pattern in his hair asked. It looked like you teleported in the 50-meter dash, but now you have minions? Do you have, like, 2 quirks? There was the standing long jump, too, cut in a black-haired boy with tape dispensers on his elbows. You did that without either of those. Maybe it's a physical enhancement quirk? I saw him break the grip meter because he squeezed it too hard, offered the tiny, grape-headed boy. Super strength, teleportation, and some sort of summoning? Does that mean he has 3 quirks? With every word, Izuku's posture grew stiffer and stiffer. This was it. Before, he was a freak because he didn't have a quirk. Now, he'd be a freak for having too many quirks. He clenched his fists, wishing to God there was something he could hit to stop the inevitable conclusion, but there wasn't, so he just resigned himself to waiting for the jeering to start. Aizawa-sensei had actually helped him out earlier, so maybe? That hope died when Izuku remembered he only intervened when Bakugo tried to attack him. The man said nothing about the curses Bakugo threw his way. His shoulders slumped an unnoticeable amount. Izuku pulled his wireless earbuds out of his pocket. He'd brought them by accident, so used to listening to music whenever he exercised that he'd slipped them into his tracksuit on autopilot, but he was infinitely thankful for that now. Dealing with the bullying would be a lot easier if he couldn't hear them, and he could at least count on Aizawa-sensei to stop them from trying to hurt him. They probably couldn't, even if they tried, due to his 45% physical damage reduction and pure strength, but it would rip open old emotional wounds that had barely begun to scab over. Izuku forced himself to ignore the indignant, disgruntled expressions of his classmates. The guy with tape dispenser elbows reached out like he wanted to tap Izuku's shoulder to grab his attention, but thought better of it. Izuku breathed an unnoticeable sigh of relief. Once everyone had gone for the ball throw, Aizawa-sensei quickly put them through the seated toe touch and sit-ups. The final test was the distance run. Everyone lined up on the running track, and Aizawa blew the whistle to signal the start. Most of the students were running, since while their quirks could give them speed in short bursts, they would quickly exhaust themselves if they tried to use them for extended periods of time. The kid with engines in his legs who Izuku secretly thought might be related to Ingenium was obviously using them to pull ahead of the pack. Izuku's long legs put him ahead by a comfortable amount, but he also found himself unconsciously using more strength so that each bound covered more distance than they normally would. By the end of the first lap around the track, Izuku and the blue-haired teen were a good few dozen meters ahead of everyone else. They were soon joined, then overtaken, by a girl with a spiky, swirling ponytail riding an electric scooter. The boys blinked and exchanged glances. By some unspoken agreement, they accelerated. Glass's engines roared even louder from exertion, while Izuku channeled more power into each step. After 5 laps of this brutal pace, Glass's began to flag. As the meters continued to pass, he slowly began to fall behind, leaving just Izuku and the girl on a scooter. By now, they'd lapped several of the slower students multiple times, and a few of them were even veering off the track, unable to continue. As near as Izuku could figure, the track was a full kilometer around, meaning he was coming up on 6 kilos. He wasn't actually sure how long he could keep this up. A glance at his stats revealed that, even after the rest of the tests, his fatigue was only at a whopping 10. That was mostly due to his vitality, which was as high as the rest of his other stats. He discovered that a higher vitality, besides affecting his HP and regeneration, led to him having more stamina, as well as an increased rate of fatigue recovery. Could he just keep running for the rest of the day? Honestly, probably. Even though he was running quick enough to keep up with a motorized scooter, which was going at probably 60 kilometers per hour, it didn't feel particularly fast to him. More like a loping jog instead of a dead sprint. Another 10 minutes and 5 laps, Izuku glanced to the side and saw that the girl with the spiky ponytail was peering at him quizzically. She seemed rather disturbed, actually. He debated asking her if she was alright, before deciding against it. He already told himself earlier that he wasn't going to interact with his classmates if he could help it. Was his will so weak that he would forget that on the first day? He shook his head scornfully, turned up his music so he couldn't even hear the hum of the scooter, and increased his speed, leaving her behind. Eventually, Aizawa-sensei flagged him down, motioning for Izuku to stop running. He slowed to a halt next to the man, plucking his headphones out. Aizawa glared at the tiny devices. "I've been trying to get your attention for 5 minutes. Don't play those so loud," he scolded. Izuku apologized, but he didn't really feel all that contrite. The slight burn in his thighs and the shot of dopamine that came from exercising had gone a long way to improving his mood, and he wouldn't let this hobo-looking man bring him down. When the class had regrouped, Aizawa-sensei turned to address them all. "It'll take too long to break down your point distribution, so I'll just show the placements." He tapped something on the smartphone-like device in his hand, and a holographic screen popped up, listing the name of all the students, along with the place they came in. Izuku was at the top, solidly in first. He'd outperformed the rest of the class on every single test except for the sidesteps. He glanced at the kid who'd managed to beat him for that. The tiny boy was staring in dismay at the leaderboard. "Last place," he murmured. His slight stature seemed to have been a major detriment to him for the rest of the quirk assessment. "By the way," Aizawa-sensei said absent-mindedly, "the person who came in last is expelled. Mineta, don't bother showing up tomorrow." Izuku jolted, his reaction on the tamer side compared to some of his classmates. "Oi, that's not fair. He did really good on the sidesteps," the blonde with a lightning bolt in his hair called, "and the rest of his scores were abysmal." "A hero cannot excel in one area at the cost of all the others," Aizawa responded instantly. "You never said last place was gonna be expelled," a young man with tape dispensers for elbows cried. "He probably would have tried harder if he knew. If he wasn't trying his best from the start, then he doesn't deserve to be here," Aizawa retorted harshly. Tape Boy lowered his gaze, chastised. Their homeroom teacher fixed the class with a sharp glare, silencing other potential complaints. "For those of you who think this isn't fair, you're too naive. The world is not fair. People can die at any time. Natural disasters, villain attacks, and freak accidents don't happen on a schedule. It's a hero's job to turn the tides in spontaneous, catastrophic situations, and they can't do that if they have no potential." Several people opened their mouths to comment, but Aizawa shut them down quickly by saying, "The next person to complain is getting expelled alongside Mineta." Everyone froze at that. Aizawa nodded, satisfied. "The syllabus and stuff are in the classroom, so grab a copy when you get back." Dismissed. The pro-hero walked away, leaving the class to stew in silence, save for the ugly sobs of Mineta. Lightning Boy and Tape Boy tried, and failed, to console the crying Grape Boy, while others looked on awkwardly. Izuku sighed, starting the walk back to the classroom. As far as he was concerned, none of this was his business and he intended to keep it that way. The next morning, Izuku was slightly shocked to find Mineta sitting in one of the desks, pale and shaking, but still there. Izuku's seat was right in front of the Grape Boys, so he sat down and allowed their classmates to go and interrogate the kid. As it turns out, Aizawa's expulsion had only lasted for 1 day, to scare Mineta into shaping up or face permanent expulsion in the future. It certainly sounded like it worked, if the tremble in Mineta's voice was any indication. After the drama of homeroom was their morning classes. Izuku wasn't sure what he'd been expecting from them, but it certainly wasn't present Mike standing in front of the chalkboard, lecturing the students in a bored tone. Normally, the pro-hero was so enthusiastic, both when he was patrolling the streets and on his radio show. Right now, though, it seemed not even the infinitely cheerful present Mike could make English sound fun. Occasionally, the man would shout something out loud to evoke an energetic reaction in turn, but it never quite worked. The rest of the mundane subjects followed suit. Samenta's soothing voice sent several students to sleep, and Izuku caught himself dozing off once or twice. It didn't help that the man taught modern literature, which was a hit-or-miss kind of class for Izuku, usually more miss than hit, as far as personal interest in whatever they were reading went. Ectoplasm was in charge of math, and Midnight taught modern art history. Izuku did his best to keep his eyes from lingering on the X-rated heroine, but the poses she occasionally struck made it very difficult. Then came lunchtime. The cafeteria was incredibly large, and the tables had individual seats instead of benches like Urudara. Everything was clean, and the white floor tiles were actually white, instead of beige or gray from years of concentrated grime. The food also looked fantastic, like something Izuku would expect from at least a 4-star restaurant, while still being affordable. Luckily, Izuku had made plenty of cash from dungeon running, so he didn't have to worry about the prices like he would have before. He ordered katsudon, to try it out and compare it to his mom's. Once he grabbed his tray, he purposely slowed his steps so that his classmates would all have time to sit. As expected, they mostly grouped up. Then, he went and plopped himself down at a completely empty table on the opposite side of the cafeteria. He put in his headphones, cranked up his music, and began browsing the hero forums while enjoying his lunch. He couldn't say for certain whether he preferred his mom's katsudon or this one. On the one hand, his mother's cooking was specifically tailored for his tastes. On the other, though, this was tossed together by pro-hero lunch rush at a ridiculous speed, so the fact that it tasted this good was insane. He'd reserve judgment for now, until he'd had it a few more times. After lunch was foundational hero studies, which everybody had been looking forward to. The class quietly buzzed with anxiety, some students whispering quietly to their neighbors, while others waited for their teacher to enter the room. Izuku had no clue who their teacher would be, but a yell from in the hallway made his heart sink. "I am." The green-haired teen dropped his head into his hands. "Please, God." Coming through the door like a normal person. All Might, the #1 hero, finished as he hung from the doorframe like a decidedly abnormal person. "This is such shit." While his peers erupted into noise at the entrance, Izuku's forehead thumped lightly against the surface of his desk. "Fuck," he whispered. Bakugo sitting directly in front of him the entire day, All Might teaching the class he was most excited for. He just needed the slime villain to make a comeback, and they'd have a grand old reunion celebrating the worst day in Izuku's life. All Might began speaking, so Izuku reluctantly tuned back in. "Hello, young pupils. I am here to teach foundational hero studies, where you will learn the basics of being a hero. Let's get right into it," All Might roared, dropping to one knee, flexing his muscles that bulged through the spandex of his suit. He whipped around suddenly, thrusting out a palm holding a card, the word battle engraved on it. "We'll be doing combat training, and to go with that, are these." The man pointed to a section of the wall, from which shelves emerged. Numbered briefcases sat on the shelves. Costumes made based on your quirk registration and the requests you sent in before school started. "Now, get changed, then meet me in ground beta." In the locker room, Izuku ignored the voices of his fellow males as they oohed and awed over their costumes, or chattered idly with one another. He cracked open his metal briefcase and quickly stripped out of his school uniform. It took only 2 or 3 minutes to don his costume. He'd simply sent in the business suit he'd worn for the entrance exam, and asked the support company to make a copy with more durable, yet flexible material. It wouldn't provide much protection, but it would stand up to much more wear and tear than his actual suit. There were no extra gadgets or equipment. He had his daggers, and he had his shadows. That was all he needed. Izuku straightened his black tie as he exited the tunnel leading into the fake city, finding that he was the first one out of the changing rooms. Figures. Now he was alone with his ex-idol. Looking sharp, Midoriya Shounen. All Might boomed, flashing his student a thumbs up and a wide grin. Probably fake, Izuku thought, remembering their chat on the roof nearly a year ago. Izuku just nodded curtly, leaning against the wall off the side of the tunnel and pulling out his phone. He ignored All Might's ill-fated attempts at conversation, choosing to focus on the latest hero news in America. Someone had decided to recreate the pre-quirk comic book villain, Dr. Octopus, attaching a support gear consisting of 4 robotic tentacles to their back, only to be taken out by a spider-themed hero. Looks like history really did repeat itself. Izuku smirked amusedly. By the time he'd finished the article, the rest of his class had finally finished changing, and were coming out to inadvertently save him from the awkwardness. All Might said a few encouraging words, inciting a cheer from most of the students, before beginning his explanation of the exercise. Basically, it was an indoor search and destroy, except instead of destroying, you had to secure the objective, but search and secure didn't quite have the same ring. 2 heroes versus 2 villains. The heroes had to touch the objective or capture the villains. The villains had to run out the clock or capture the heroes. Pretty straightforward, until you actually thought about it. Indoors meant limited maneuverability, and a restriction on more powerful attacks, since there was the risk of bringing the building down on your heads. Also, heroes needed to be more careful about property damage, as a general rule. The villains, on the other hand, didn't need to hold back quite as much. On top of having time to set up traps within the building, as well as knowing the location of the objective while the heroes had to search for it, the villains had a distinct advantage. Then again, wasn't that what Aizawa had said yesterday? That it was a hero's job to turn the tides in situations like this? So, although All Might was reading the instructions off a script, it seemed he had put more thought into this than Izuku had expected. Izuku was probably being a bit harsh on the pro-hero. The man had been the #1 for decades. He would know better than anyone that you couldn't always punch your way out of a situation, and would have developed the sharp wit necessary to save lives in low-key disasters. "Now, we'll draw lots to both determine the teams, and who you'll be facing off against," All Might announced, picking up one of the 2 boxes that had been sitting next to his feet. Izuku found himself on a team with the girl with a spiky ponytail, the one who'd made the electric scooter for the long-distance run during the quirk assessment. They were up against Bakugo, because of fucking course, and a kid with white hair, wearing a white jumpsuit, and half his body covered in ice. It looked vaguely Terminator-esque, especially with the glowing red eye. "A pleasure to make your acquaintance, Midoriya-kun. My name is Yaoyorozu Momo. I hope we work well together," Yaoyorozu introduced herself. Was she a rich girl, or just cultivating an image for her hero career? Well, no matter how proper she acted, her costume completely ruined the effect. A red leotard, open down the middle, with one yellow belt wrapped around her waist, and another slightly above her sizable bust. She was showing even more skin than Midnight, the R-rated hero. Izuku didn't let his eyes linger. She might be beautiful, but he wasn't particularly interested in her. He also wouldn't give her the chance to accuse him of being a pervert to everyone who would listen. Izuku simply nodded without saying a word, and returned to staring at the clear blue sky above. The occasional fluffy white cloud would roll by, but otherwise, the atmosphere remained static. Do you know what Bakugo-kun and Todoroki-kun's quirks are? Yaoyorozu asked. Her tone made it clear she did. She was just checking if they were on the same page. He nodded once more. Do you have a plan to deal with either of them? Or will you simply face them head-on? Your quirk is probably strong enough to do so. My quirk, on the other hand, requires a bit more careful thought. Quirk, quirk, quirk. It grated on his ears to hear that word say so many times in quick succession, but considering the situation, decided it was probably necessary. He pointedly ignored the fact that she'd basically just implied he was a mindless brute. I should probably explain, Yaoyorozu explained. My quirk is called creation. Using lipids I store within my body from eating, I am able to make any inorganic object, so long as I know the exact chemical formula for it. Well, it was certainly an interesting quirk. The possibilities for something like that were endless. Izuku imagined her tossing a bucket of napalm at Bakugo while he was mid-blast, and erupting into a violent firestorm. The imagery made him chuckle. Is there something funny? Yaoyorozu asked, a hint of an edge to her confusion. As if she was saying, you better have a good reason for laughing at me, or else. The idea of this exhibitionist threatening him made Izuku want to laugh even louder, but he refrained. No need to cause a scene and push her to recruit their classmates in a crusade against him. It'd happen eventually, but he at least wanted to enjoy a few days of relative peace before his life at U.A went to shit. Nothing really, Izuku replied blandly, the corners of his lips still raised. He could sense her examining him, trying to determine the validity of his words, before eventually giving up and taking him at face value. As you say, in the assessment, Todoroki-kun used ice. However, since his hair is both white and red, as well as him being Endeavor's son, it is possible that he also has some form of pyrokinesis that he has not yet displayed. Izuku nodded thoughtfully. That was a sound enough theory. Todoroki-kun showed incredible power with his ice alone, however, and Bakugo-kun nearly matched him. They took third and fourth place, respectively, in the exam. I may have placed second, but I am unsure if I would be able to match up to them in real combat. As such, I propose that I play support while you confront them head-on. I can make smoke grenades and flashbangs to interfere with their vision, noisemakers to distract them, and small projectiles to hopefully get a lucky shot. Izuku nodded again. Sounds good, he murmured lazily, not offering up any information himself. Out of the corner of the eye, he could see Yaoyorozu puffing up, like she was going to berate him for his lack of cooperation. Luckily for his ears, though, she was cut off by All Might's voice over the speakers. 5 minutes are up. Hero team may enter the building. With that announcement, Izuku strolled towards the front door, hands shoved into the pockets of his black dress pants. What, Midoriya-kun? You can't go in through the front. What if the villains have set up a trap? Izuku, hand on the doorknob, stared at her for a moment, saying nothing. Then, he opened the door and stepped into the building. His teammate followed, and gasped at the sight before her. Sure enough, like she'd predicted, Bakugo was there, likely waiting to ambush them as soon as they entered. However, instead of glaring at them viciously and shouting ugly slurs while sparks danced across his palms like he did just about any time he interacted with Izuku, the blonde was face down on the floor. A shadow soldier stood over him, unmoving. Izuku casually walked over to the prone villain. Good job, he told the shade, who preened at the praise, before turning his attention back to Bakugo. He levered a foot under the teen's shoulder, then flipped him onto his back. Even unconscious, the blonde's face was contorted into a harsh scowl, muscles pulling in a way that had to be uncomfortable, and would probably leave his brow sore when he woke up. For a second, a fleeting moment that had already passed, a dark part of Izuku, the part that had helped him survive the dungeons, that learned to thrive in the wild danger and craved the violence of battle, urged him to take advantage of this opportunity. With his strength, one solid stomp was all it would take to shatter Bakugo's skull underfoot. It wouldn't even require his full power, just like crushing a bug. The blonde would never be able to harass him again. Izuku shook his head. He wasn't naive enough to think that heroes never killed, but he did know that they avoided it unless there was no other choice. And right now, with Bakugo out cold on the floor, and barely able to prove a true threat even when he was awake, Izuku certainly had a lot of other choices. He turned away with a scoff, and began walking down the hall, looking for the stairs that were nearby according to the building blueprints they'd memorized at the start of the exercise. "Are you simply going to leave him like this?" Yaoyorozu asked, still frozen in place. "What if he wakes up? Tie him up if you want. I can just leave my shadow to watch him," Izuku tossed over his shoulder, not stopping his slow, ambling steps. If the bully did wake up, the shadow soldier would just knock him out with another blow to the back of the head. Just as he began walking up the stairs to head to the second floor, All Might announced over the speakers, "Bakugo Shonen has been captured. One villain remains." Yaoyorozu caught up with him quickly after that. If she said anything, Izuku didn't hear her, too caught up in his thoughts. For years, Izuku had dreamed of one day getting his quirk, of finding out that Tsubasa's stupid pinky toe joint test had been inconclusive and statistically insignificant, and showing it off to Bakugo, to all the people who'd belittled and berated him for having a dream far above his station. In most of those fantasies, Bakugo would stop bullying him, and maybe even be his friend again, now that Izuku had proved he could stand beside him as a pro-hero. In some of those delusions, he'd even imagined himself finally standing up to Bakugo and beating him in a fight. Everyone has daydreams like that, don't judge, and being filled with a sense of pride. Izuku knew he'd changed since his awakening, become another person entirely, both physically and mentally. However, there was no greater sign of just how much he'd changed than the fact that he felt nothing at finally proving to Bakugo that he wasn't just a pebble on the side of the road, he was a goddamn mountain in his own right. No pride, no vindication. Not even sick pleasure at seeing the bastard on the ground before him, a complete reversal of their roles as bully and victim for the past decade. It happened, and Izuku didn't care. Couldn't care, not with the things he'd seen, the vicious enemies he'd fought in the dungeons, the pain he'd suffered as he honed his skills. Compared to all of that, Bakugo was nothing. Not even a pebble on the side of the road. Just a speck of dust, floating around haphazardly, that could be waved aside without a second thought. That stopped him cold. Who am I? Izuku wondered. Who have I become? Midoriya Izuku was a kid with a big heart and bigger dreams. Dreams he could never hope to accomplish, but wouldn't stop chasing. Now, they're in sight. The day he becomes a real hero is almost at hand. With this power, granted to him by the system and made his own by his efforts, it was just a matter of time. Yet, it felt like he'd traded his heart for it. There was just a void in his chest now, black as his shadow and colder than ice. Once, he'd looked up to All Might. Wanted to be just like the #1 hero, wanted to save as many people as he could with a reassuring smile on his face. After seeing the truth behind All Might, though, he couldn't fathom being like that fraud, running around with a fake grin, crushing the dreams of kids that idolized him. Once, he'd believed in the inherent goodness of humanity, thought that every life was precious, and deserved to be saved, even from themselves in the case of villains. Then they showed him their worst sides for 10 years, and he became jaded. Tears at the report of another death on the news became winces of sympathy, became casual disregard. After all, they were probably just another person that would hate him for being quirkless, for losing out on the genetic lottery. Deep down, Izuku had been relieved that he'd never have to meet those people. He wouldn't have to disappoint them, too. Once, he wanted to be a hero. Now, Izuku wasn't sure what he wanted. It was like he was going through the motions at this point. It felt like he hadn't been excited about being a hero in forever. He was grateful for his awakening, because it meant he was no longer powerless in a world where everyone had some sort of superpower. He was proud of passing the entrance exam, because it showed him how far he had come, how hard he had worked. He was ecstatic to be here at U.A, not because it was one step closer to fulfilling his childhood dream, but because he'd proved everyone wrong. He was worth something. He wasn't quirkless, worthless Deku. He deserved to be alive. But with all these selfish feelings inside his black heart, there wasn't any space left for other people. He loved his mother, but she was one person. How could he become a hero that saved everyone, when he didn't even care about humanity? Tapping on his shoulder brought him to the real world. He found himself crouching low, a hand on the floor to keep his balance, while the other rested on his knee. Why was he breathing so hard? Why were there dark spots in the corner of his vision? Why did it feel like, no matter how much air he greedily gulped in, he couldn't breathe? Midoriya-kun? The tapping evolved to full-on shaking. Midoriya-kun, are you alright? Yaoyorozu sounded concerned and panicked. Izuku shot to his feet, making the rich girl step back with a yelp. He regretted it almost immediately when he lurched to the side, barely catching himself on a wall before he could fall back to the ground. He pressed his clammy forehead against the blessedly cool concrete, and pulled violently at his tie, completely ripping it off and tossing it away from him. The top 2 buttons of his white dress shirt were next, popping off with barely a tug. It helped him, a little bit. For a few moments, Izuku focused on the contractions of his diaphragm. In through the nose, out through the mouth. In through the nose? The soothing rhythm grounded him, enough that he could actually comprehend the words falling out of his partner's mouth. He turned his head slightly, still resting it on the chilled stone, to side-eye Yaoyorozu. She seemed to take that as a good sign. "Are you all right?" she asked, stepping closer to put a hand on his arm. Izuku's nostrils flared as he took one last mighty inhale, before slowly letting it hiss out through gritted teeth. Fine, he rasped after a moment, fighting against his heavy tongue to make the word come out. Yaoyorozu pursed her lips, looking like she didn't believe him even a little bit. "I think you should sit down," she finally said, after examining him with a keen eye. "No, I'm okay," he whispered breathlessly, further fueling her skepticism. "You certainly do not seem it," she replied primly. "I will tell All Might Sensei to call off the exercise." His breathing was somewhat back under control, and his heart was no longer pounding in his chest like a prisoner in a cage, trying to get out. He swallowed thickly, then pushed off the wall. For a scary moment, Izuku thought he'd overbalanced, and was going to fall on his ass. Yaoyorozu seemed to think the same, because she latched onto his arm to keep him steady. They were both proved wrong when he managed to stay on both feet. "See?" he asked rhetorically. "Fine." The exhaustion in his tone did nothing to convince her. "Let's go," he said, ignoring her suspicious gaze. He had to pause after his first step, knees weak and legs wobbly. He sucked in a breath, then took another step. This one was stronger, enough that he didn't shake. Another breath, another step, and it seemed like his body had gotten with the program. "Midoriya-kun, perhaps you shouldn't push yourself," Yaoyorozu said, tightening her grip on his arm, preparing to pull him to a halt. "I have to if I want to be a hero." The rich girl let out a resigned sigh, but didn't say anything else. She did, for some reason, keep hold of him, which slightly irritated Izuku. "I don't need your help to walk," he growled. It took a second for the girl to realize what he was talking about, but when she glanced down at her hand, which was wrapped around his forearm, her face exploded into a brilliant blush. She let go like he was made of burning coals. My apologies," she cried, dipping into an overly proper 90-degree bow at the waist. "I forgot myself for a moment. It was not my intention to make you uncomfortable." Izuku just stared at her. "Whatever," he muttered, the excessive formality making him shift in place a bit. He began walking once more, faster than before, not caring if his teammate kept up or not. A few minutes later, they'd reached the 5th floor, the top of the building. A chilly gust had blown down the staircase connecting to the 4th floor, so Izuku had some idea of what to expect, but was still a bit surprised to find the entire corridor frozen over. Ice covered the walls, roof, and ground in a centimeters-thick layer, sharply decreasing the temperature. Luckily, he adapted easily to the sudden shock of cold due to his high vitality. He began walking gingerly over the ice, then sped up a bit when he realized his agility and dexterity made it much easier to keep his balance. By the time he reached the room where the bomb was located, which he knew through his link to his shades, Yaoyorozu had only made it a quarter of the way. She looked positively mutinous, furious at being left behind without a second thought. Izuku didn't bother waiting for her as he opened the door and walked in casually, acting like there wasn't an unconscious Todoroki laying face down on the floor, similarly to Bakugo at the entrance to the building. The part of the fake ice thing covering the left half of Todoroki's head was shattered, revealing his red hair. Izuku shot the shadow soldier standing over the teen a thumbs up, receiving a cheeky salute in return. It didn't seem bothered by the cold at all, which, considering it was a reanimation, made sense. Izuku pressed his hand against the papier-mâché nuclear bomb, and listened as All Might shouted over the speakers. "Hero team wins." Back in the observation room, Momo didn't know whether to be furious or sympathetic with Midoriya Izuku. The standoffish boy had had what she thought was a panic attack, but had also completely disregarded her presence during the exercise, even shaking off her attempts to help. The 4 students who scored the highest on the quirk assessment, and he'd made the other 3 look like complete fools. It was absolutely infuriating how far above her he was, and it seemed the rest of the class felt the same, if the way they awkwardly shifted when All Might Sensei asked who they thought was the MVP was any indication. It was Azui-san who finally bit the bullet and spoke up. "Well, the MVP would have to be Midoriya-chan, Karo, since he did everything himself. His summoned soldiers incapacitated both the villains, and he retrieved the objective." All Might nodded seriously, ever-present smile looking a bit strained. "Well put, Azui Shaojo. You are correct. There are several problems with the way this exercise turned out, however. The most major issue I witnessed, which was present in both teams." All Might pointedly looked at Momo, Midoriya-kun, Todoroki-kun, and Bakugo-kun. The latter 2 seemed infinitely frustrated. Something Momo could empathize with, though to a lesser degree, was the distinct lack of teamwork. Midoriya-shounen more or less disregarded Yaoyorozu Shaojo completely, despite her attempts at cooperation. On the villain team, Bakugo-shounen and Todoroki-shounen did not even speak, simply leaving each other to their own devices. Once more, congratulations to the hero team for their victory. And now, let us move on to the next match. All Might finished. He was eyeing Midoriyuku strangely, like he wanted to say something, but was holding back. For some reason, the sight made Momo a bit uneasy. Anything that could worry All Might was definitely cause for concern, and it seemed the rest of the class had also caught on, judging by the furtive glances they were sending the green-haired boy. Midoriyuku remained as stoic as usual, ignoring his classmates and leaning against the wall casually, arms crossed over his chest. Eventually, Momo dismissed her worries. Midoriyuku's business was not her own. Hopefully, it would stay that way. Izuku dropped heavily into his chair the next morning, and immediately buried his face in his arms. He could not believe he'd just done that. He'd taken the train to school, as he does every morning, but as he approached the front gate for U.A's campus, there had been a crowd of people standing in front of it. Izuku had stared at them for a long moment, wondering what to do, and in that time, someone spotted him. "Hey, he's a U.A student," somebody shouted, and soon, they were swarming Izuku. Several people shoved microphones and cameras in his face. Reporters? What were reporters doing in front of U.A? There was no way the school would have allowed something like this. Then he tried actually listening to what they were asking, and, "What's it like, having All Might as a teacher?" Okay, yeah, he could see why they were here now. It wasn't every day the country found out that the #1 hero was going to become a teacher, and any student lucky enough to be under his tutelage was bound to turn out to be someone amazing. They probably thought, unaware that All Might actually wasn't that great of a teacher. Also, it's All Might. Of course the press was going to be all over every single little move he made. But that didn't mean Izuku had to like it, or that he knew what to do in this situation. He never expected to find himself in this situation. Sure, he'd fantasized becoming a pro hero for years, sometimes even being the #1, but none of those daydreams included handling the press. They were all about fighting powerful villains and rescuing countless people. So, it wasn't much of a surprise that his mind blanked at that moment. And when the mind was no longer in control, instinct took over. Bloodlust activated. The reporters froze, several of them visibly shivering. Izuku was also frozen, though it was more in mortification than fear. "Excuse me," he mumbled, and quickly pushed his way through the crowd. Well, more like they made space for him, unable to even look him in the eyes, and walked past the gate. A short walk later, and he found himself here in 1A's classroom, feigning sleep whilst internally panicking. "I can't believe I just did that. I used a skill on civilians. That's basically the same thing as unlicensed quirk usage, right? Right. Oh, God, am I gonna get arrested now? Is Izawa-sensei gonna apprehend me as a villain when he gets to class?" Okay, now he was being ridiculous. There probably wouldn't be consequences besides a few complaints, and that was if those reporters realized that Izuku had actually done something to them. Maybe they'd chalk up to his height? He was quite tall now, about the same height, or maybe even taller than. He wasn't sure, since they hadn't stood right next to each other, his one classmate with 6 arms. Tall people were intimidating, with the way they loomed over you. Izuku knew that from experience as a result of once being the runt of his class. Aside from his little island of gloom, though, homeroom was filled with a pleasant serenity as his classmates chatted with one another enthusiastically. It seemed they had bonded over the training exercise yesterday, watching their peers show off their quirks and technical skills. Those who worked together also seemed to have bonded a bit, for the most part. The one exception was, obviously, Izuku. Todoroki was quietly talking with Yaoyorozu, who seemed somewhat familiar with him, indicating that they were acquainted before UA. Even Bakugo was part of a group, despite how reluctant he seemed. Kirishima, Kaminari, Ashido, and Siro were doing their best to include him in their conversation, laughing off his harsh insults. He would have to watch out for them. No doubt Bakugo would turn them against him as soon as he could. A few words about what a freak he was, or his past as a quirkless reject, and they'd be sneering at him like he was trash, too. Izuku didn't dare try to interject in one of the many newborn cliques surrounding him. He could sense that his classmates didn't quite know what to make of him, but their opinions were definitely leaning more towards negative. That much had been made obvious yesterday, when they'd hesitated to declare him the MVP. There was no arguing with it, but it seemed to him like they'd wished there was. He sighed. Begrudging respect was probably the best he'd get out of them. He wasn't naive enough to even hope for friendship. Eventually, the bell rang, and everyone sat down before Izawa-sensei could come in and scold them for being rowdy. The room fell silent when their teacher stepped in. He cast a blank stare over them, before nodding approvingly. "Good, you're in your seats. I've reviewed the footage of the combat exercise, and most of you did pretty well. I've only got a few complaints at the moment. Midoriya, Bakugo, Todoroki, there's a reason we put you on teams. Learning to work with others is an essential skill for heroes. Nobody can do everything on their own." The only response he got was an aggravated TCH from Bakugo, as the blonde was reminded of his complete and absolute failure. Izawa remained unperturbed, though, and continued on. Now, on to business. I probably should have had you do this yesterday, but I had other things to attend to. Today, you'll decide on who's going to be your class representative and your vice rep. I don't care how, just get it done before homeroom is over. Izawa took a second to glare at everyone, activating his quirk for good measure, the red eyes conveying a clear threat. And do not wake me up. With that ominous warning, the man climbed into his garish yellow sleeping bag, rolled into a corner, and promptly passed out. Izawa-sensei's words were forgotten about 5 seconds later, when the class erupted into noise, people clamoring to be chosen. Unlike in junior high, where the class rep position just meant tedious work, at U.A, it was the chance to gain some leadership experience before hitting the pro hero scene. It would be good practice for those who would go on to be in charge of their own hero agencies. Ida made a speech about how democracy was the best approach, and most people agreed, so a vote was cast. Izuku, not knowing anything about any of his classmates, simply wrote down Yaoyorozu's name. She seemed pretty put together yesterday, so maybe she'd do alright. She was also a recommendation student, according to some chatter he'd heard, and she'd done fairly well on the quirk assessment the other way. He didn't particularly care. The ballots were collected and tallied, then names were written on the board, along with how many votes each person got. As expected, Izuku's name wasn't even put up as if anyone would vote for him. Yaoyorozu was in first, with 3 votes, while Ida got 2 votes, making them the class representatives. Izuku tuned out their obligatory thank you speeches and promises to do their best. Alarms sounded during lunch, but it was just because the press had gotten onto campus unauthorized. Which, really stupid, those guys were definitely gonna get arrested. It didn't seem like that big of a deal, so Izuku just ignored the situation, since it had nothing to do with him specifically. For foundational hero studies today, they were in Gym Gamma. Yesterday, you got a taste of actual combat with your quirks, Izawa-sensei announced once everyone had gotten changed into their costumes. Today, you'll be practicing combat without them. Many students groaned, but shut up quickly when Izawa leveled them with a fierce glare. I don't want to hear any complaints. You won't always be in a situation where you'll be able to use your quirks to properly aid you in a fight. For example, what if you're fighting someone with an ability like my erasure, leaving you unable to use your own quirk? Nobody had an answer for that. Izawa-sensei nodded, satisfied that they understood him. Now, I'm gonna pair you up randomly and let you spar for around 10 minutes, just to see what I'm working with. Then, in the second round, I'll make the matches more even. Izuku ended up paired with his 6-armed classmate. His name was Shoji. He was perhaps a millimeter shorter than Izuku, if that, and his quirk was called Dupli Arms. The ends of his arms could turn into either hands or an assortment of sensory organs. His capabilities for parallel processing and information gathering must be incredible. Izawa called for the matches to begin, and Shoji made the first move, rushing towards Izuku. With a few powerful bounds, the masked teen was on Izuku, raining down blows with his numerous arms. Normally, you'd expect someone with 6 arms to have an advantage against someone with only 2, if neither were using quirks. Shoji's extra arms seemed to be a passive mutation, rather than something he consciously formed. Yet, for all the attacks being launched his way, it was a walk in the park for Izuku to deflect them due to his high sense and agility. Izuku made a few aborted moves to retaliate, but hesitated and ultimately did not hit his classmate. He'd never fought another human before. He wasn't actually confident in his ability to control his strength in a fight. What if he hit too hard? Sure, it wasn't as if he broke everything he laid his hands on like a mindless juggernaut, but fighting required a certain level of uncontrolled control, if that made sense. After a minute of a sustained barrage, Shoji finally backed off, breathing a bit heavier, while Izuku looked and felt fresh as a daisy. They kept up like that until Izawa-sensei finally called the class back together, and he paired them off with people closer to their skill level. Towards the end, though, he hesitated. Izuku, along with Todoroki and Yaoyorozu, were the last ones left. The latter two, due to their families, had gotten formal training through the years. As a result, their unarmed skills were a cut above the majority of the class. Sensei, shouldn't there be an even amount of people in our class? I believe we have 20 students, no? Yaoyorozu asked, eyeing Izuku warily. She probably didn't want to be partnered up with him. That's my fault, Todoroki said. I accidentally gave Uraraka a bloody nose. He pointed off towards the sideline, where Uraraka was indeed standing, a red-stained tissue held up to her face. Izuku quickly averted his eyes. Izuku blinked. He wondered if he should say that would be completely unnecessary, considering his experience in the dungeons, but kept his mouth shut. Movement in his shadow made him look down, into the glowing emerald eyes of his most powerful soldier. Igris? It was a bit comical, how only the knight's head poked out, as if the rest of his body was buried. His red ponytail was halfway submerged, making it look shorter than it actually was. For a few moments, Igris simply stared up at his liege, trying to communicate something with just his solid-colored eyes. It took a while for Izuku to understand what he was trying to say without being able to speak. "Oh, sensei, could I spar with him?" he asked, pointing at the head on the ground. Aizawa-sensei balked at the sight. "That's one of your summons, right? The ones you used in the entrance exam?" Izuku nodded, and refrained from mentioning that Igris hadn't really done much during the practical then play Janken with the others. Aizawa-sensei probably didn't care about all that. The man glanced between Izuku, his shadow, and Shoji for a few moments, deep in thought. He was clearly wondering what to do with Shoji, since he wouldn't have a sparring partner. His problem was solved for him a moment later, when one of the other students cried out sharply. Spinning towards the noise, Izuku saw Gravity Girl wait. Her name was Uraraka, covering her face with her hands. In front of her, Todoroki stood awkwardly, fist still outstretched from his last attack. "Uraraka, can you continue?" Aizawa-sensei asked, walking closer to them to examine the injury. Gently, Uraraka removed her hands, revealing that she was mostly fine, save for the trickle of blood streaming out of her nose and down her lips. Izuku shivered at the sight and averted his eyes. "Never mind. Go clean up in the bathroom. Do you need to go to Recovery Girl?" Uraraka prodded her nose carefully. "I don't think it's broken," she said, somewhat nasally. "I should be fine." Sensei nodded. "All right, Shoji, take her place. Uraraka, you'll rejoin the class once the bleeding stops." The students he addressed nodded, Uraraka scampering off towards the bathrooms in the corner of the gym, while Shoji took her place in front of Todoroki. With them taken care of, Aizawa-sensei turned back to Izuku, and stared up at Igris for a moment. The knight had risen completely from the shadows, towering above everyone in the room at over 2 meters tall. He might even be taller than All Might. "I saw that one come out during the entrance exam, but it didn't seem to be doing much," Aizawa-sensei noted. Maybe he was doubting Igris' ability to be a decent sparring partner for Izuku? Izuku shrugged. "I guess he didn't really feel like it." Sensei quirked an eyebrow at that. "They have free will? Yeah, that should have been obvious, right? Igris had come out of his own volition, after all." Izuku tilted his head in consideration. "I think the stronger shadows have more personality, though. Not that his basic infantry were a bunch of puppets. Those chuckleheads messed around too much to be mindless." Sensei nodded slowly at the information. "Well, get started, then." Izuku faced Igris, and noticed the blade the shadow was holding. "I think we're supposed to be practicing hand-to-hand," he said. Igris glanced down at his sword, then stabbed it into the concrete floor next to him. He reached up and unclasped his cloak, the billowing pseudo-fabric evaporating back into the darkness. It was like the job change dungeon all over again, down to the way Igris flexed his clawed gauntlets, and Izuku grinned ferociously. Igris took a step forward, and Izuku matched him. Both drew back their fists, ready to kick it off, when they were interrupted once more. "Ah, it's you," Uraraka shouted, jogging over to point at Igris, making both him and Izuku straighten up out of their combat stances. "I was wondering why I didn't see you after the entrance exam, even when school started. Thanks for saving me back then." Then she turned to Izuku. "Ah, but he's one of your shadow guys, right? I guess I should be thanking you, then?" Izuku furrowed his brow. "No, I didn't even know he helped you." He turned back to his shadow to see if he could parse some sort of explanation, just in time to catch a vicious cross to the face. The thunderous crack echoed through the gym, making the other students pause in their matches to stare at the cause. Their initial confusion slowly transformed into horror as Igris began a relentless assault on his master. Dazed from the strength behind the blow, and completely taken by surprise, Izuku was thoroughly on the back foot. He attempted to raise a guard, but it was dismantled with ease, Igris knocking his arms aside. The knight then snatched Izuku by the face, and slammed the back of his head into the floor, creating a sizable crater. His plated hand moved down to wrap around Izuku's neck, while his free hand delivered a few lightning-quick strikes to the teen's gut, like a sledgehammer, knocking all the wind out of him and causing his diaphragm to seize momentarily. Izuku kicked out, slamming his feet into Igris' armored chest, but the shadow took the hits without relaxing his grip in the slightest. The sudden lack of oxygen was making it hard for Izuku to use his strength. Raising an arm, Igris' massive broadsword ripped out of the concrete it had been impaled in and flew into his hand. At the same time, Aizawa-sensei's capture scarf wrapped around the same hand. Yet, the knight ignored it, bringing his blade down to rest against Izuku's neck, the kiss of shadowy metal against his skin making him shiver. Igris stared down at him with his indecipherable solid eyes, and something clicked in Izuku's head. "Why you win?" Izuku choked out, tapping the arm wrapped around his throat. After another moment of staring, Igris finally released him, standing up. Izuku inhaled so fast he choked, coughing a bit which aggravated his sore esophagus. A moment later, thanks to his high vitality, the pain more or less disappeared as his regeneration kicked in. Izuku pushed himself to his feet, prodding his face carefully. That first hit felt like it had fractured, or outright broken, his jaw. It certainly sounded like it. Midoriya, Aizawa-sensei called, getting his attention. The man looked like he was gearing up for a fight, quirk activated and capture scarf still wrapped around Igris' arm. What was that? Nothing, it's fine, Izuku said with a wave of his hand. You're surprisingly petty, you know, he told Igris. The shadow shrugged. That didn't look like nothing, there was an edge to Sensei's voice. He probably wouldn't let this go until he got a proper answer. Izuku sighed. Last time we sparred, I won because I fought a little dirty. I guess he was holding a grudge, he explained. There was a hint of amusement in his tone. Although he didn't necessarily like being hit that hard, especially in the face, the situation was a bit humorous. Also, he certainly hadn't expected that from his first and most loyal shadow. Is he above me? It was a humbling thought that one of his subordinates would grow faster than him. It was clear, the first time they fought, who was superior. Yet now, it seemed the tables had been turned. Were he to fight Igris head-on, without any underhanded tricks, would Izuku be able to win? Maybe, maybe not. Izuku hummed thoughtfully. I've been too lax, he said to Igris, who shrugged once more. That was as good as outright confirmation. It made him wonder, if the gap between him and Igris were to grow wide enough, would his shadows lose their faith in him? Would they rebel, detesting Izuku for being a weak leader? If he lost the loyalty of his army, did he have their loyalty to begin with, though? The thought made him freeze. They were here because he killed them, then used shadow extraction to resurrect them, placing them under his command. He twisted their souls, subjugating them. They didn't join him of their own volition, he didn't recruit them, he enslaved them. Izuku glanced at Igris, who was staring at him impassively. Do you resent me? He wanted to ask, but held his tongue. Could he handle the answer to that question? He vaguely registered Aizawa-sensei telling him he was done, to sit out for the rest of the exercise. He was much more focused on watching the night slowly sinking into the darkness, making eye contact the entire time. A warning. Become stronger, or I will topple your throne. And with that, we've reached the lastest chapter. Sadly, there is no update from the author. For now. Of course, if the author added more chapters, then I'll post more parts in the future. With that, take care, God bless you all.